Whether you preach a lot or a little, all of us want to not waste too much time prepping sermons, but still preach effective ones. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 7 ways to reduce time on sermon prep.
Thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and with me today and every other episode is Dylan Dodson. And today we're going to give you 7 ways to reduce time on sermon prep.
Yes, if you preach regularly or irregularly,
Yep.
those posts can be helpful for you.
Yes.
You can spend a lot of time on sermon prep, but after a certain amount of time, and it's probably a little bit different for each person, your returns are diminishing and just not a good use of time. And one thing that's always interesting, I thought it was interesting, especially early on, people would talk about you need to spend less time on sermon prep so that you can spend more time doing other things, which sure, I mean, that's true.
Yeah.
But I also just think like you just shouldn't spend tons of time on sermon prep because it's just not helpful and it doesn't even make it any better. And so even if you're like, I don't have a million other things that I have to be doing, that like if I don't reduce this by a couple hours, life will be crazy. I still think your sermons will be better if you do them a little bit more habitual and disciplined and more focused and less amount of time.
Yeah.
And you probably won't dread it as much either because you know what you're getting into. It's a lot harder to write sermons when you're like, I don't know what I'm going to do this week. I don't know how it's going to look like. I don't even know how I'm going to start. So this is not just so you can spend less time so that you can do other things, which that might be a side benefit of it. It's just, I think they're just better overall when you're not spending tons of time on them.
Yep.
So
Agreed.
Here are 7 ways to reduce them. Now, we've done a lot of episodes on sermons and ways to prep sermons and all that sort of thing, but this episode is just on less time.
Yes.
And how it can still be probably even better.
Yep.
So here's how you can do it. Number 1, same time or times every week. In other words, when you are writing a sermon, prepping a sermon, that you should do them at the same times every week. It should not be, I've got to write a sermon this week and I'm not sure when I'm going to do it. Or there's a couple of times, pockets of time that I might do it and it might not work very well. We're a big fan. We talk about this very often on this podcast about scheduling things, even if ministry can appear to be more flexible time-wise, to have certain things that you do at the same time every week so that you can be more focused, have rhythms and practices and do them more efficiently and do them better because they're not always like, when am I going to do it? And particularly if you do preach pretty consistently, preaching's probably an important job of what you do if you're a consistent preacher at least. And so it needs to be prioritized and not just thrown off because you're not going to get better at it if it's just always a thing that you do whenever. And so when you do it at the same time every week, not only do you have I know when I'm going to get it done, but you also can, and we'll talk some more about this with some of these other ones, you can also schedule it more and figure out how long it takes you to do it and also give yourself some deadlines, which we will talk about here in a second as well. But I think one of the biggest things that I would do to recommend is that just by doing it at the same time every week and having it on your schedule, and it can't just be open-ended. Like it can't just be, I'm going to work on a sermon all day on Tuesday. And if and when I finish it, then I'll work on other stuff. Again, we'll talk about timing it here in a minute. But I think the first step is to pick a time or times, if you're going to break it up, to do them the same time every single week.
Yeah, I think it just helps to be in a routine in general. Like this is one of the big benefits that if you are in, like if you're not bivocational, obviously if you are, then some things may be out of your control. But if you aren't and you have full control of your schedule, then you can kind of control your schedule clearly. I mean, you can control when you do these things. And so since it's an important thing, there's not really a need to kind of just throw it in wherever, but pick whatever day of the week you decide to and just have it that every week. And it may seem like, yes, obviously like you can technically do it other times, but I think it just really helps you to get in the routine of, that this day is going to be spent doing this for this amount of time, which we'll talk about. But that way it's not left like at the beginning of the week especially if you're not ahead, which we'll get to, but especially if you're not ahead, you're not like worried about, am I going to accidentally push it till too far towards the end of the week or kind of get myself in a bind if things come up, but you just know this day each week, this time each week, I'm going to be working on it. And unless some catastrophe happens, it's pretty much going to stay that way every week. And I think it'd really help you just get in a routine of doing it and get a little more productive doing so.
And it's different for everybody. A couple episodes back, I'm not sure exactly the number but I talked about specifically my sermon prep routine, which we won't get all of it into it here, but I pretty much Monday through Thursday have something to do with sermon prep on my calendar every day.
Yeah.
And It's on a typical week. It's Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday for hour and a half. It's about this week's sermon, and then on Wednesday I have a larger chunk of time where I'm studying and prepping a future sermon.
Mhm.
And so, but it's the same time every week, so I know when I'm doing it. And again, in terms of like not being stressed out of like I don't know if I'm going to preach or I don't know when I'm going to do it. Like I know when it's going to be and I know how long it takes me to do it and I know I'm going to do it in the allotted time. And so it's not that sermon prep doesn't ever get stressful or anxious or like, hope it's not going to be bad and that sort of thing. But it is a lot more, it takes a lot, it doesn't take a ton of thought effort other than when I'm actually doing sermon prep
Mm.
because I know here's on the calendar when it's going to get done and it's going to get done. And I'm just not thinking about my sermons all the time because I know and my mind knows like, oh, it's on the calendar, it's going to get done, and so
Yeah.
it's just a lot less stressful in that end. So.
And if there's ever, I don't know if you've experienced this. I haven't yet, but I could imagine if you're preaching every week that you may. Like if you come across a sermon or a topic, or maybe if you're preaching elsewhere that you're not looking forward to as much as maybe normal. Like whether it's just something that you think is going to be a difficult topic, or might take a lot of prep, or just something that for whatever reason, it's easy to kind of push those things off a little bit, or to dread that it's coming up. And this way, it's just like it's happening the same time every week, whether I'm excited about it or if I'm really not excited about it that week. It kind of takes that decision making off your plate a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and that's part of what's reducing the time is you're not like having to pump yourself up to like, okay, I got to work on it. It's like, no, I'm just going to work on it now.
Yeah.
Like right now, as of recording this, we're doing Mark, and so we did Mark 13, the first half of it last week, and the second half of it this week. And it's pretty much Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple and when he's going to return. It's just confusing. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and you have to explain a lot of stuff. And I didn't look forward to this past week's sermon, and I'm not looking forward to this coming week's sermon, just because it just feels like it's just like an information dump, which is what we try not to do. But it's just really confusing. And again, knowing that, like this morning when I went to kind of get my notes and stuff ready for the Sunday, it's like I could just sit there being like, I don't want to do this. This is confusing. It's like, well, whatever. It's on the calendar. I'm just going to do it.
Yep.
And so that definitely saves some time. Really, I mean, this is just for anything you do, but obviously we're talking about sermon prep. It's on the calendar. I'm doing it. I'm not wondering when to do it. I'm not putting it off. Like I have to do it now. And so that's how it saves you time. You know it's coming up, and it saves your mental energy because you're not thinking about it at other times of like, when am I going to get to this?
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Whatever it looks like for you, you can tweak it. I mean, my personal sermon prep stuff has changed a lot over the years, and so it's not like what you pick now has to do what you have to do forever. But pick the same times, whatever it works for you, and do them the same way every single week, and tweak it as you need to. But it just will save you a lot of time and a lot of mental energy when you're not wondering, well, I'll get to it, or when am I going to get to it, or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think that's good. I think it's helpful, especially if you're just starting out. Just pick a time and go. Like obviously, it might not be perfect, but I think we can get so paralyzed in decision making and worried about picking the right time or the right day, whatever. Just pick a time and day, and if you get to it and realize like, hey, it needs to change some, then change some. But it doesn't need. You don't need to wait until you figure everything out and have the rest of your schedule completely ironed out to then fit this in. But just pick some time and start with it, and just kind of iterate from there.
Yep. So same times every week. Number 2, your same setup every week. Now, this is different for people. Again, we talked about my setup, and when I did the thing, I use Logos for the Bible commentaries, and I use 2 monitors and whatever. It's my setup works for me. It's a good time. I think what can be hard is some people are different, and some people do. And part of this is personality or whatever, and so I get that. But like people will be like, I'll talk to guys like, yeah, I'm doing sermon prep at a coffee shop this week, and I'm doing it here this week, and I'm like, well, first of all, how do you do it at a coffee shop? Because it's just very distracting, which we'll talk about in the next point. Why I would not recommend that. But anyway, not just the same time, but the same environment can help you set clear expectations just for yourself. So if the place you're going to do the prep is different every week, or sometimes it's a distracting environment, sometimes it's not. It gets really hard to get it focused and get it done when you want to do it. And so I would recommend finding a setup that works for you, and not just like a physical location, although I certainly think that's part of it, but also like a sermon prep setup. Like how many commentaries or books do you use on average? And that might be a little bit different, but like trying to figure out that limit. I personally am a less is more type of approach. I typically use 2 commentaries, and I've got pretty much I use 2 commentaries and a study Bible. I don't use a ton of stuff. And then Google, which is hit or miss. Now I read them and personal study and stuff over time, but like I don't use tons of stuff. You could disagree with me there. That's fine. That's the same. What it looks like. Now this could be for you, like what you eat, what you drink. If you snack on something, like I would just figure out something that's like a comfortable, habitual thing for you that it's the same place and the same feel every week. So there's just less variables when you're trying to sermon prep, because sermon prep itself is variable enough in terms of the text and if it's confusing and if it's things are making sense or things are not, how you're feeling that day. There's already enough variables, and so you want to reduce as many of the ones as you can, which
Yeah.
is your schedule, but also what your setup looks like. And so trying to find out a setup that works for you. And if the coffee shop actually works for you, fine. But I would like go to the same one
Sure.
and do the same thing every single week. But the same setup will also help you reduce time. So you're not like fidgeting and finagling and trying to get everything working wherever you're going every time.
Yeah, I think it's just part of like making things simpler so that you can get to work quicker or like get started quicker. Where if you're trying to like figure out, I mean, obviously you're probably not figuring out which commentaries use the morning you're sermon prepping, but like
Right.
figuring out which the kind of getting things organized in logos if you do it that way,
Yeah.
if you don't have it saved, and trying to figure out the best way to do it, or trying to think that morning of where am I going to go, or how am I going to set things up, or whatever. It just adds a lot more decision making to it. It makes it harder to get started. And I think, at least for me, like sermon prep can be at times, I mean, sure, it can be like stressful at times, but
Yep.
for me, since I'm someone who doesn't do it every week, I look forward to it when I get to. And so if there's like a setup that I'm comfortable with, if it's something that I've developed over time and something that I'm used to doing, it helps me to look forward to it a little bit more, because I know like I'll get there and I'll get to start doing it, and it's just this kind of setup that I'm not being forced to use, but I actually like figuring out what works the best for me. And so it just helps me to look forward to it a little more, which if you're doing it every week, that you'll be able to develop that a lot quicker. I think it'll just help you like actually look forward to those days that you're spending in sermon prep.
And if you're someone who wants options and you want to do it in different places, I would just recommend that you can have the same setup any place that you might do it. So, like for me, we moved recently, and so our new house has a guest room / office. And so finally, recently, I got a second monitor, got a keyboard. I pretty much have the same exact setup of stuff at our house as I do here, other than a standing desk.
Yeah.
So I can't stand. But now, last couple of weeks, I've been doing, last 2 weeks at least, on Wednesdays when I typically do my sermon study stuff. I've been doing it at home, but because my setup is actually the same, other than I'm not standing.
Right.
But I have my two screens. I've got a study Bible thing at home. I've got Logos makes it where I can have my commentaries anywhere I go. My mouse has a certain keyboard that I like, and all these sort of things. So it's like, even if it's not necessarily in my church office, everything else is the same. Where if I was going somewhere with only my laptop and not my second monitor for sermon prep, that would be a lot of a big change for me. It would certainly slow it down, because I use two monitors from one, and all my commentaries are digital. And so whatever that looks like, even if you're someone who wants to change and that's good for you, that's fine. I would just say, can you emulate your setup wherever you are going? Because if not, then that will certainly cost you more time.
Yeah, and I think if you do want change and things like that, I think it's good to figure out the things that you need to not change. So if you want to go to different places, that's fine. But before like the morning of, like obviously do this ahead of time, but figure out the things that you actually need to replicate as much as possible here. Like obviously, if you're going to a coffee shop, you're probably not going to be able to have two monitors. That would be tough. But maybe the alternative is if you use Logos, like have that up on an iPad and then you make it work. And I don't know if that's perfect or not, but like figuring those things out ahead of time, if you actually want to change locations, or if you don't have a permanent physical location and kind of have to change locations sometimes or whatever, but figuring out before the day of what you actually need your setup to be, or what kind of things you actually need, so that morning when you're getting things ready, you can just go and start, and not trying to figure out like, how would I replicate what it is in the office here, and trying to figure all those things out, but you're just ready to go.
Yeah, so same times every week, same setup every week. It takes a lot of the time that maybe it's not on your calendar, but getting ready, trying to figure things out. It takes it out, and then therefore you've spent less time, wasted time.
Yep.
I recommend. Number 3, would recommend a large block of uninterrupted time, and I would add with a deadline at the end of it. So, again, I'm all for different people have different strengths and desires or whatever, until there's data involved that is pretty objective. This is the best thing to do, or the more focused thing to do. And I've mentioned Cal Newport. I'm a big fan of his. One of the books, one of my most favorite books of all time that he wrote, called Deep Work, argues that human beings can have, and it's different, but maybe 3 to 4 hours of prime work a day, like focus work, and it's a little bit different for different people, and you can train yourself, to go a little bit longer. but it's about 4 hours max for anybody.
Yeah.
And so in his book, he talks about distractions and all these sort of things. But long story short, he's a proponent of like trying to get like 3 to 4 hour blocks of uninterrupted time a day. We're doing stuff that's you're focused, you're not distracted, and that sort of thing. And so I've through the years tried various things of different types of sermon prep.
Mhm.
And I'm not diagnosed with ADD or whatever. And I'm not a fan of when people were like, "Well, I just have ADD," because I'm like, "No, that's a real thing." So I don't
Yeah.
think I have ADD, but I do would definitely say I'm someone that gets easily distracted, like
Sure.
easily distractible, which I think a lot of people are,
Mhm.
particularly in our culture today with our phones. Like we just are. And so I've tried like the tomato timer where it's like 23 minutes and
Yeah.
stop or these sort of things. And then when I read Deep Work, I was like, I don't know if I could do it. And so this is anecdotal experience plus his data made a huge difference for me. So again, for what I do, like on Wednesdays, is I'll take 8 a.m. to noon, and I'll have a 4 hour block on my calendar where it's sermon. So I'm studying for and writing a future sermon because I'm ahead, so it wouldn't be week of, and that's all I do. I have like my phone somewhere else. It's on do not disturb. Like I don't check email. I don't do anything, and I just sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to like take a break, but I don't. I mean, I'll go to the bathroom.
Right.
I'm not going to try to convince you why that's true. I would just I recommend Deep Work, and he talks all the scientific stuff behind it, whatever, and how like when you go from one task to another, your brain's just like not there completely. And it takes like 20 minutes for it to refocus and all those sort of things. And all that to say, I would recommend when you're doing like the studying and the initial writing of a sermon to do a couple of hour block, and that's all you do, and then you have to be done by a certain time.
Mhm.
Now I've done this for a while, and so it's different. And it would not work out like this if we were starting New City today. Like it just
Right.
wouldn't. So that's
Yeah.
part of it. But now it's like I'm done by 12, often beforehand. So 3 to 4 hours, and I've got a sermon that's not. I mean, I could preach it; it wouldn't be great.
Yeah.
But I've got points. I've got stuff. Now, part of what makes that better is we do what's called a sermon review, which we'll talk about here in a second. So because I'm ahead, and then a week or two later, I'll go over it with Brian and another lady here at our church, and so we'll talk through it. And so being ahead also helps you reduce sermon time because you're not like stressed out of like I have to figure it all out right now. You can come back to it later. But I write it and I'm done, and the fact that I have to be done means like I'm gonna finish. And there are times it happened a couple weeks ago, but I mean it's rare, like once every 4 or 5 months, maybe, and that's not an exaggeration, where I have to go past 12. Like it's extremely rare. And again, I've been doing it for a while, so that's part of it. And I've got to set a system and set up, but it's the same time every week. I've got the same setup every week, so this is helpful. But it's like it's not just I'll work on this all day Tuesday and whatever else I get to, because I don't know what the rule is. I mention this often and never look it up. There's a name for it that your tasks just expand to the amount of time that you give them, and we all know this, but this is the time I get, and so I'm studying on it, and then it's like it's written. And so I would just like before you be like, well, that doesn't seem very spiritual. I would just try it because I don't think like checking your phone every 5 minutes and taking 8 hours. It sounds more
spiritual.
Yeah, it sounds more spiritual on your calendar,
Yeah.
but the fact that you're switching tasks, you're not actually focused. That's probably not, or it's not. I would say it's probably not. It isn't. So anyway, I would recommend a couple hour block. Just try it. And it's going to be hard the first couple times, like to not check anything, to not do anything, but do it. And I have found that it has significantly reduced the amount of time because it's on the calendar, a certain block, and it's like I have to be done by this time, so I'm actually going to be working on it the whole time.
Yeah, and I would say like if really regardless of what stage you are, if you're trying to change things up or trying to get things started in sermon prep, to just try it for like a block of time. Like don't assume obviously like afterwards you talked about obviously you review it the week of, so your whole sermon, I don't know what you'd say like the whole length of your sermon prep process is, but it's more than just that one day with review and things. But it's probably not as long as kind of you hear some guys talk about how their sermon prep time is like astronomical sometimes. And so if you feel like you're taking forever to do it, or even if you feel like you need to take forever to do it, I would just start here. And maybe you'll need longer than 4 hours. You probably will in the beginning if you're not used to doing this, and it'll probably start dwindling down over time. But don't just assume that you can't do things in one block of time because you haven't before. I guess is kind of the moral of the story. Like if you're used to just taking days and days and just a lot of time and like stacks of commentaries, whatever, don't assume that you can't truncate the time down a little bit because you've never done it before. Because you probably can. And there's probably a lot of less than super focused time in there if you're taking a huge amount of time, because we can't focus for or I shouldn't say we. Most people can't focus for all day, just an 8 hour straight day.
Nobody can.
Nobody can. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't believe you can. Yeah.
That's
And so, and I also don't think most people would claim that they can.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to do just like these huge stretches of time, it probably isn't working out super well. So try this, and maybe it'll end up taking a couple days of these like large blocks of time, and then that can start dwindling down. And if you do 4 hours and you don't have a sermon prepped and done by that time, I would still, unless you're prepping your sermon on Saturday, still be done and pick it up
Yeah.
next week or the next, whenever it's on your calendar next. Because it'll take time to get quicker. But if you just keep trying to go until it's done, then as you're getting later and later in the day, I think your quality is going to be a lot less. Your time's just going to start dragging out. So give yourself a cutoff deadline. And if you're not finished with a sermon, that's next week or that's the next day, whatever time you have it on your schedule next. And I think you'll, I mean, I've said this for like all these, but I think you'll enjoy sermon prep more if you don't feel like it's just going to be like an unending task that you just got to keep going until it's done.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we're talking about here is just reducing your distractions.
Yeah.
And then therefore you'll have more time because you're not like, I'll check my email real quick, or I'll check Twitter real quick, or
Right.
the news, because I'm just like, no, it has to be done by this time. I'm gonna put it on the calendar, gonna turn all the distractions away. And I think that'll go a large time of not just I'm gonna aspire to be done, but like whatever this is, it's just gonna be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so giving yourself a hard deadline, especially when you're trying to initially write and everything, will help you reduce time because it's like you have to focus and not just I'll get finished when I get finished with it. So,
And this will help you not have to it'll help you be able to plan things for the rest of the day. Whatever day, if you set 4 hours aside for this, then in the afternoon you can schedule meetings with people or you can do other things. It's not like I have to block out my entire day because who knows how long sermon prep will be.
Yep. So large block of uninterrupted time. I would recommend that. And this we do. So number 4 is to get ahead. We always say this. So,
but maybe
just
this is
put
your
it here.
your first episode.
This is probably
and
some
have
of
no
you
idea.
have it listening for the first time.
That's right.
For sure. I would say at least a week, just a week. So for some people, so in New City, I'm about 4 weeks. I've done like 4 to 6. I've really tried to stay to 4 because 6 can be too much sometimes in terms of planning other stuff. But that's fine if that sounds crazy. I would just say just 1 week. So in other words, the week, if Sunday is coming this week, then you're not working on this Sunday's sermon. You're working on the next one.
Yep.
And you're like, well, how do I do it? Well, you can write 2 sermons in a week. I mean, that's not to say like it has to be like, but I mean, they used to preach multiple sermons in a week.
Right.
Now I think the stakes are a little higher now. The sermons have to be better now because of various things. So
Yeah.
I'm like, you can, or the next week you're not preaching, prep a sermon for the following week, and then you're always 1 week ahead. This is just, it not only takes a lot of stress away, but it makes it a lot quicker in the sense when you're writing a sermon because it's the pressure's not here. It's not due right here. So like on a Wednesday when I'm doing my 4-hour thing, like I can like be like I need a story here, or like I don't have this point worded the way that I want to. Now part of this has to do with reviewing your sermons with others, which we'll talk about in the next point. But you don't have the pressure of like this has to be it. So again, for me on Wednesday I do my prep, and then like we'll go over it at some point next week or two with the sermon review. But then the week of, on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, I go over it. So Monday, I kind of reduce my outline, my notes down, and then Tuesday and Thursday, I go over it out loud. And so I'm talking through it. I'm going over it again. Like there's times I've gone over it with some other people to get their feedback from it. So part of being able to have a firm deadline, like I was talking about on the last point, is that like if it's due this week, that firm deadline does get a little hard. Although you certainly can abide by it because it's like, well, if this thing isn't finished, I have to say something.
Yeah.
And I still think you can abide by it, but it just gets a lot easier. And so if you're at least a week ahead, you don't have all the pressure of I have to get this finished right now. So you're a little bit more loose, and which means it's a little bit more easier to write. And so even if it's just 1 week ahead, I would just try it. That's my thing for everybody. Just try it for a couple of weeks. I promise you, it's easier said than done. It's easier to do than you think.
Yeah.
And it will make your time reduce because you're not stressed out trying to I have to have this finished today when you're writing it week of.
Yeah, over the course of the years of this podcast, however long we've been in existence, I have had times where I've
4 years.
4 years.
Been this for
Dude,
4
really
years.
4 years? Jeez,
Yes.
oh, Pete. There's been times where I feel like I have come down too hard on the way other people do things because it's different than me. And you know what? There are people much smarter who have been doing this much longer and much better who maybe do this a different way. But I would say, especially for a church planter, like so, I'm assuming relatively newer, not been preaching for 10 years, 20 years, probably not one of the most gifted communicators in the world, as we aren't either. This really helps. And like I hear guys that say like I was writing this sermon, in their sermon saying like I was writing this sermon on Friday, or I was writing this sermon on Thursday, and this came to me. And I'm like, dude, I like everyone has different personalities. I would not want to do this if that was the requirement, because that just sounds so incredibly stressful. Like there's been multiple times, not every time, but multiple times where writing a sermon and get stuck on something where like whatever, need an illustration or just not really sure how to communicate a certain thing, where if I was like I got to give this in 3 days, maybe I could still figure it out, and maybe it wouldn't be as good, maybe it'd be fine, but just the like stress of having to figure it out that day would make all this far less enjoyable. And I've mentioned that multiple times because I feel like this should be something you enjoy, and like your quality will change if you enjoy the way you're doing it and what you're doing, and you'll look forward to coming to work. And so if this is just a really stressful thing of I got this deadline, like our point before, but I have this deadline because I got to give it in 4 days or 3 days or whatever, and so I got to write it, review it, all those things. That just sounds, maybe you live off stress. I don't. That just sounds really stressful to me, and I feel like you're going to be rushing things, and the quality will definitely be diminished if you're just trying to get things that day. So get ahead. It's really not. It's not as hard as it sounds, especially if you actually plan out how you're going to do it.
Yeah, so getting ahead again, it's not just makes you feel less stressed that week, which is a side benefit, but for this particular episode, it does help you with time because it's like, I don't have to have this 100% finished right now. Now, you still want to like finish it as best you can, but it's like I don't have to have it all 100% finished right now. Makes it easier to like have your deadlines and to keep going, especially if you have a routine of, I know I'm going to look at this again, whatever your calendar looks like. Your brain knows like I'm not 100% finished with this right now. So that's really helpful for me when I do my Wednesday thing. It's not just that like I'm going to review it with other people and that sort of thing. It's like, but I have a system in place where I know this is going to get taken care of. And when every week you're not sure when you're going to get to sermon prep, you're not sure how long you're going to do it, and it's not all on the calendar, and your setup's different, your mind can't trust that it's going to get done, and so it gets a lot less stressful. And so I with this setup too, with being ahead and having same time, same week, same time, same setup, like I just know it's going to get done. There's this thing in ministry of like Sunday's always coming, and it is always coming, right? But I don't like feel that tension the way I hear other people sometimes talk about it, because it's like, well, I got to write a sermon. I got it. Yeah. It's like, well, my biggest thing for me writing a sermon, it's a process, it's done. And it's also Monday morning. I'm not waking up wondering what I'm going to preach that Sunday because it's already been worked on. And so I'm going to still tweak it and that sort of thing. And it might not be 100% yet, but I have a good idea and I'm not starting from zero. So.
And one benefit to this, which this doesn't necessarily affect time, but it maybe a little bit, it allows you to not always be thinking about your sermon, which I don't, sure, maybe ideas come to you, but like I don't think it's the healthiest thing to just be thinking about it all night when you're at home and spending time with family and stuff. But if you're struggling because you know that it's got to be done this week and you have something that you're stuck on, it's a lot harder to kind of turn your brain off and not worry about it and not think about it when you're outside of work, when you're outside of prepping it, if you know it's got to be done within the next couple days.
Yep. So that was number 4. Get ahead. Number 5. Review your sermon with others. It can just be one person. It's looked different for us various times. Right now, it's Brian and this woman named Stephanie who goes to our church. And so on Mondays we talk through a sermon coming up, and I haven't. So basically, on a Wednesday when I write the sermon, I haven't looked at it again until whenever we do our message collab review, whatever you want to call it. And I just talk through it. They have it up and we talk through what was confusing, what didn't make sense. I'll sometimes put a note like at the beginning of the sermon, like stuff that like I need help with, like I need some more stories or some of these points. Like I'll make notes while I'm writing the sermon of this point is what I mean, but this is what I'm trying to communicate, but this doesn't sound the best, or I need a story of like this, or what is this? What do you guys think about this? And so I'm like putting notes in there as I'm doing it, which really helps when I'm writing the sermon because I know it's going to be reviewed and it doesn't have to be finished right now. But it helps you get ahead. It helps you, save time because again, it's going to be talked over. So I don't like preach the whole thing to them. I just like talk through it in like 15 minutes, and then we spend some time going over what was confusing, what was not, and their feedback on it. This isn't everybody studies the text and brings their ideas. We talked about this in another episodes. We've tried various ways of doing it. I don't think that's very effective because at the end of the day, whoever's preaching the sermon has to preach it. And so if you're trying to use other people's points, it just kind of feels weird. And sometimes they'll say things that are really good, and I'll decide not to use them for it could be any reason.
Yeah.
Because I'm preaching it, or it just didn't really feel like it sounded good when we were talking through, but then when I was like preaching it that week or going over it that week, I was like, this doesn't fit well. And so it's not that I do everything that they say or whatever, but it's really, really helpful. And especially when I'm doing my main sermon time, it's like I know I'm not only going to review it, but other people are going to review it. And it takes about an hour, 75 minutes once a week. And so, but it's really helpful. And it takes a lot of the stress off of doing this. Again, you have to be at least a week ahead so you can like go over the sermon with somebody.
Yeah.
So that kind of is part of it. But reviewing it with others reduces a lot of stress, knowing you're going to get some feedback on it as well.
Yeah, it helps. You can just, if you get stuck somewhere, you can just put a note and move on. It
Yeah.
really takes out those like roadblocks of whether it's a story or just like something that you're having trouble communicating, of like trying to figure this out and spending too much time on it. Or you can just put like, need a story about this, or I mean, sometimes I'll highlight kind of things and just put a bunch of question marks afterwards and then just move on, because I know I don't have to, I mean, like we said, I don't have to have this done today, obviously, like ready to preach, but also it's going to be reviewed by others too, where I know in that case I can explain what I'm trying to communicate, and then we can kind of put together what would be the best or most effective way to communicate this idea. And so to me, sermon prep, message collab, we call it, or reviewing the sermon with others, it helps write the sermon, but also it helps you get rid of all these roadblocks or whatever they're called, brain farts. I don't know if there's a better term for it, but that you can just keep plugging along instead of getting stuck.
And you don't have to have people who like know tons about the Bible to have somebody. Because
yeah.
at the end of the day, if it's confusing to somebody, it's probably gonna be confusing to other people. And so certainly if you have some people on staff or at your church who really enjoy this and have some knowledge, that's great. But you can also certainly invite other people who just love Jesus into it as well. Because again, if it's confusing, it's just confusing. And you're just trying to get feedback. And so we recommend that. We recommend also, having a woman as a part of the team as well to get, if you're a guy and if your staff's guys or whatever, it's mostly men. It's like you need to get some other perspectives as well to save you from saving some dumb stuff and from getting, other perspectives as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think that's a good point. You don't need people who have gone to seminary. You don't need people who are pastors. In fact, this has changed obviously over years because staff has changed and things like that. But we've had people that had gone to seminary and people that haven't. And of all the people that have gone to seminary, very little of the feedback is like people coming with their own preconceived notion of the passage or way to communicate of like, I know this about it, and so you should add this. But it's more just like reviewing what you said. And so, it's really just if someone wants to do it, obviously if they love Jesus and care about what you're doing, but they don't need a whole bunch of like prerequisites to do it. They just need to be willing and available.
Yeah, practically for what it looks like for us is we use Google Docs, and so I mean you can look at it ahead of time, or you could just have them show up and they're reading it as you're reading it. They're taking notes, and then you talk through what they thought.
Yep.
So reviewing it with others not only makes the sermon better, but it can reduce sermon prep time because hey, if you're stuck somewhere, you're going to be able to talk through it with somebody else.
Yep.
Number 6, this is, this somewhat is helping reduce sermon prep, also helping you maybe be a better preacher, and that is to focus on one thing to improve on at a time. So there's always stuff that you could get better at, and what you can try to do if you're trying to like get better at a lot of stuff and write sermons, it could just be a lot. It can take a lot, and you just never know what to focus on. So I would recommend like listen to yourself, have other people listen to your sermons, maybe share a sermon or two with another friend who's preaching, and you give some feedback on a sermon, and they give you some feedback on a sermon, and that sort of thing. But focus on one thing at a time. So if there's multiple things you want to get better at, storytelling, introduction, pacing, whatever, movement. That's a lot of stuff to focus on. It's like I don't know how you would do all that. What I would recommend is like, what's one thing that you want to get better at, and work on that for like 2 or 3 months. And you could even make a note in your notes of like, slow down or pacing or eye contact or whatever it is. And just for a few months, there's other things you can improve on, but just like that be the main thing that you're working on at a time so that you can get better, because you're not going to get better just by reps alone, which you, especially in the beginning, you will improve, but
Yeah.
at some point it is going to be what it's going to be unless you're intentional about it. But if you're wanting to get better, find one thing, even if there's multiple things you're like, man, I need to get better at this, and just work on that until it becomes more of a habit and becomes a little bit better, and then you can focus on another thing. But when it comes to improving, this can also slow you down. So I would say pick one thing at a time, give it a couple of months before you try to focus on something else.
Yeah, let's not forget that like the hope is that you're in this for the long game, and that you don't need to like go from where you are to perfect preacher in a month. Well, you won't. I mean, and you don't need to try to. And so figuring out one thing at a time to improve on, it may feel like, oh, I'm not making progress, or because I have this, especially if you're more critical, you might have like a laundry list of things you want to improve on. But that's the only way you're really actually going to improve is just to focus on one thing at a time. And over time, you will be improving, and you'll probably be improving pretty drastically if you do it this way. But if you're just like, if you feel like you got to fix everything right away, nothing is actually going to get fixed because you can't focus on so many things at once. So don't forget, like you're in this for the long game. You're going to be doing this for a long time. Hopefully, that you have time to improve it one thing at a time and not try and do everything at once.
Yep. So focus on one thing at a time.
Yep.
And then last but not least, have this last for a reason. And that is to, well, you do have to preach a lot of sermons.
Yeah, that does help.
So to get better, you'd have to preach a lot of sermons, but it's last because it's not like the primary or the only thing. Like I think it's really easy to assume, well, I'll just get better the more that I do this. And it's true to a degree, but then you're just like, you will kind of plateau and you'll just be what it is because you never were intentional about other things. And so you do have to preach a lot of sermons to do these sort of things, but you have to be intentional. So that's why I would say focus on one thing at a time. You also need to have like, when it comes to preaching sermons, you need to have like good study habits. So a lot of the stuff is important, like same time every week, same setup, large block of uninterrupted time, because you can, practice does not make perfect, it makes permanent. So what you practice is what you will end up just doing.
Yeah.
And so if your sermon prep process is all over the place and you don't really focus on getting it down to a time and to a place and on your calendar to a specific, like it's just going to always kind of be all over the place. And so what you have to do is you need to be able to preach some sermons so you can practice your prep and your delivery and all these sort of things. But every time you do it, you need to be practicing or working on all these things that we've talked about so that you can get your sermon to a manageable time. So for me, it's different for everyone else. I would say about 10 hours a week. So let's just say 4 hours on a Wednesday, 3.5, 4 hours on a Wednesday. And then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the week of, let's just say an hour each time. It's a little bit bigger in the beginning of the week and less towards the end. So that's 7-ish. Maybe this is 7.5. I don't know. And then we do sermon prep. We go over it. That takes like 90 minutes sometimes. So that's about 9 hours. So, I mean, those aren't like perfect times. So maybe, And then Sunday morning, I go over it at my house. I read over it, for about 20 minutes Sunday morning before I come to the church. So that's what it looks like for me, and it's different for other people. It doesn't, it might be more for you or whatever. I mean, it could be less. If it's less, I would, it's fine too. I mean, if it's like 5 hours, my only question is like, are you just kind of winging it a little bit? And so you make sure you're studying and that sort of thing. But the more you do this to encourage you, like it will get a little bit easier and you will get a little bit quicker, but that part of that is contingent on finding healthy practices and rhythms of sermon prep so that you're not anxious about all the time, thinking about all the time. It does get better as long as you're intentional with how you do it.
Yeah, I think preaching a lot of sermons, it's like it if you don't, how do I put this? It will not fix really much of anything just alone if you preach a lot of sermons and don't do anything else. However, if you do everything else but you're hardly ever preaching, you're also not going to make many changes, because if you're getting an opportunity every 6 months, it's really hard to actually make habits out of that.
Yeah.
And so preach as much as you can. I mean, obviously if you've planted, you'll be preaching a lot, but if you're in like the pre-launch phase, or if you're in a residency or on staff at a church, obviously take every opportunity you can get, but ask for opportunities. Because especially if you're maybe not in a residency but on staff but wanting to plant a church, it just may not be known that you want to preach a lot, or they may just be assumed you have other things that you have to do. And so just communicate with either it's your pastor or churches in the area, like, hey, call me for opportunities, because I want to get better and I want to be able to do this. But you can line everything up, but if you're not preaching much, it's not going to make a bunch of a difference. But you could also preach a ton and really make no progress if you're not intentional about actually making a difference.
And that's a good point too. If you're wanting to plant one day or wanting to preach more, letting your pastor know, and also like churches and other churches, particularly smaller churches in your area,
For sure.
like it's a thing that churches need people to come in and fill in and preach. And so especially if you're part of a network or something like that, that's a big advantage of saying, hey, Just so you know, if there's anyone that has a need, you can tell people I'm happy to do it.
Yep.
And I like something that Brian said. I think the last times we talked about preaching on this episode or this podcast, and that if you don't preach regularly, whenever you do are scheduled to preach, the tendency is to like, again, we fill our time with however much we have. It's like to spend like over prep.
Yeah.
But like, how would you prep if it was, you know, more of a regular thing? Trying to figure out that and still give yourself the same amount of time and not to spend a ton of time thinking about it because it's not going to get any better.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely. Yep.
yeah, I don't know if you had any.
No,
what you would say that,
yeah,
but-
it's like you can. It's easy to like take those rare opportunities that you get if you're early on, and just make that the most important thing. Which maybe it is more important than everything else you have going on right then, work wise. But just let it drag on forever because you're so nervous about it being so good, or you just want it to be as good as you can, or you don't want to like squander the opportunity. But the only way that all this will really like work out well for you, and you can create actually like lasting habits, is you take those times and treat it like this is just an every week thing, and treat it like you want to do it when you actually plant a church or want to do it down the road. And that's how you can actually like make lasting changes versus just trying to, you can spend all this time prepping, deliver a sermon, and maybe it'll be good because you spent forever on it. Who knows? But it's like, did I actually learn much from that process, or did I just really create something that's really impossible to replicate once I actually plant this church?
Yeah. Yeah, so preach a lot of sermons helps, but you got to have good study habits to reduce the time.
Exactly.
And one thing to say too, if you're listening to these podcast episodes and you're always like, that's a lot of information, maybe some of it was good, we have show notes.
We do.
So you always can, wherever you're listening to this, if you're listening to this and not watching the YouTube channel, you can click on the podcast app, and we have a list of everything we talk about, like all the points on every episode right there.
Yep, exactly.
So that you can get them. So those are 7 ways to reduce time on sermon prep. Hope that was helpful. If you want some other things that are helpful, practicalplanting.com, the website, a lot of free resources, got a free newsletter, got a social media thing that we send out for free. You can get that. If you're on Facebook, you can join the Practical Church Planting Facebook group. Just a side note, we have rules and we kick people out a lot. You'd be surprised. No spam. So if you have videos of yourself preaching, you're gone.
Yep.
Nobody wants to watch that.
Yep.
But if you have questions, legitimate questions, that's the group for you.
Exactly.
Or if you have a resource that is helpful and somebody has posted in the group, you can comment with your resource.
Yes.
But we will deny. We won't kick you out for posting your own resource unless you do that a ton. But we will deny the post.
Yes.
But if it's
Yes,
helpful to someone else, then you post it in the comments.
I'm a rare person to join many Facebook groups because so many I feel like are not very well moderated. This one is well moderated,
Yes,
and
we moderate.
we decline a lot of posts.
We do. All right. So anyway, hope that was helpful. We'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.